Welcome to a journey through time. Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to this narrative that will transport us to Brazil in 1884, on the eve of the abolition of slavery. Today, we'll discover a love story that defied all the conventions of its time, the unlikely encounter between a coffee colonel and a daughter of former slaves on a plantation in the Paraíba Valley. This is a story about courage, dignity, and the transformative power of true love. In times of great social change, two hearts will meet and change not only their own lives, but an entire community. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, from what city are you listening to us? I'd love to know where our story is reaching you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that like to help us continue bringing these narratives that warm the heart. Now, close your eyes and imagine yourselves transported to year 1884, Santa Helena Plantation, Paraíba Valley, São Paulo. The morning mist embraced the Santa Helena plantation like a grayish silk veil enveloping the coffee plantations that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air carried the sweet and earthy aroma of ripened beans, mixed with the humid perfume of the earth after the night rain. Colonel Joaquin Alberto de Vasconcelos walked through the plantation grounds on one of those June dawns, when the cutting cold of the São Paulo winter made the servants retire earlier and the animals seek shelter. At 29 years old, he carried on his shoulders the weight of a coffee empire inherited prematurely, after yellow fever took his entire family. His steps led him to the warehouse, where the coffee was stored in enormous jute sacks. The half-open door caught his attention. In the dark interior, a small and delicate figure rested on the grains, wrapped in a faded blanket that had known better days. Maria de los Dolores slept the sleep of the righteous, her serene face contrasting with the precarious conditions around her. 24 years of life had sculpted in her features a melancholic beauty, like that of a rose that bloomed in arid soil but did not lose its essence. Her dark hair, braided simply, framed a countenance that spoke of dignity, maintained even in adversity. Joaquin Alberto felt something tighten in his chest. How could he have allowed someone under his protection to sleep in such undignified conditions? His indignation grew when he remembered the dry words of Doña Perpetua, the governess, explaining that dependents must know their place. The sound of his steps awakened Maria de los Dolores, who opened her eyes startled. For an instant, their gazes met in the midst of the penumbra, his charged with controlled rage, hers with surprise mixed with apprehension. "How long have you been sleeping here?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Maria de los Dolores straightened slowly, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. Humiliation colored her cheeks, but she did not lower her eyes. 18 moons, sir," she replied, her voice sweet as wild honey, "since I came from Syrah." His words cut the morning air like a sharp blade. "This ends today." How would the discovery of this injustice forever change the destiny of both? The sun was already rising through the tops of the coffee trees when Maria de los Dolores found herself before what had once been the room of Mariana Candida, the colonel's deceased sister. The ivory-colored walls had delicate paintings of violets that seemed to dance in the golden morning light. Joaquin Alberto observed silently while she contemplated the environment, her hands still trembling slightly from emotion. A bed with a jacaranda wood canopy dominated the room, covered by a quilted bedspread embroidered with silk threads that told stories of happier times. "This will be your room," he said, his voice laden with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed. "No one else will sleep in the warehouse while I own this land." Maria de los Dolores touched the blanket delicately, as if it were a sacred relic. She never imagined she could inhabit a place of such beauty and refinement. The aroma of dried violets still subtly perfumed the air, as if the presence of the former owner still blessed that space. "And Doña Perpetua?" she whispered, well knowing the governess's temperament. Joaquin Alberto's eyes darkened like storm clouds. "Doña Perpetua will learn that in this house the decisions are mine." The first lunch together in the main hall was a moment of strange intimacy. Seated at the mahogany table that had already served 3 generations of the Vasconcelos family, they shared not only food but their first confidences. She spoke of the drought that had devastated her homeland, taking her parents. He revealed how loneliness consumed him since yellow fever swept through his family. It was when Major Venancio arrived, a neighboring landowner and man of possessions, that social reality returned to knock at the doors. His eyes surveyed Maria de los Dolores with poorly disguised disapproval. "Joaquin Alberto," he said, his voice loaded with patriarchal authority. "What mixture is this at your table?" The silence that followed was dense as molasses. Maria de los Dolores lowered her eyes, her heart racing, but Joaquin Alberto straightened his shoulders and faced the visitor's gaze. "Maria de los Dolores is a lady companion of this house," he replied, each word carefully chosen, "and she will be treated with the respect due to her position." What consequences would this first social confrontation bring? It was on a golden July afternoon that Maria de los Dolores discovered Francisco, hidden among the rusted gears of the old sugar mill. The 8-year-old boy had in his eyes the same melancholy she recognized in her own reflection, the mark of those who lost everything very early. Chiquito, as he was known, lived on alms and leftovers since cholera took his parents. He slept in the abandoned shack, among ghosts of a time that was fading. When Maria de los Dolores found him, he was devouring a green mango with the hunger of one who didn't know when the next meal would be. "What are you doing here alone, child?" she asked, her voice soft as silk. "I live there," he pointed toward the ruins of the shack, "with the others who have no place." Maria de los Dolores' heart tightened. She saw in him the reflection of her own childhood of abandonment and need. Without hesitation, she extended her hand to him. "Come with me." When Joaquin Alberto saw them entering the big house, she determined, he small and frightened, he knew something fundamental had changed. Maria de los Dolores' courage in breaking all conventions to save a child touched his soul unexpectedly. "This is Chiquito," she announced, chin raised in silent defiance. "He has no family or home." Joaquin Alberto knelt before the boy, observing his large and intelligent eyes, the dignity maintained even in misery. Something about little Francisco reminded him of himself in childhood, the same thirst for knowledge, the same need to belong somewhere. "Do you know how to read, Francisco?" "No, sir, but I want to learn." The decision was made in the silence of the heart. Joaquin Alberto turned toward Maria de los Dolores, and in the looks they exchanged, a silent pact was sealed. "Francisco will be educated alongside the overseer's children," he declared. "Our child cannot live without hope." What social revolution would this brave decision unleash? The changes at the Santa Helena plantation did not go unnoticed by the vigilant eyes of Doña Perpetua. The governess, a 60-year-old woman molded by the rigid social conventions of the empire, watched with growing horror the disorder that had settled under the roof she had administered for 2 decades. On a rainy August afternoon, while drops drummed on the clay tiles, she plotted her revenge in the silence of her room. The imperial diamond brooch, Mariana Candida's inheritance, would be the perfect weapon. With trembling fingers of rage and determination, she hid the jewel among Maria de los Dolores' few clothes. "This house will return to order," she murmured to herself, "even if it's the last thing I do." 2 days later, the captain of the National Guard arrived with his escort, the sound of horses echoing in the courtyard like distant thunder. Joaquin Alberto received them with due courtesy, but a somber presentiment weighed on his chest. "Colonel," said the captain, removing his cap, "we received a report of theft. A brooch of inestimable value would have been stolen from this property." Maria de los Dolores' eyes widened with terror when they found the jewel among her things. The tears that rolled down her face spoke of a pain deeper than humiliation. It was the disappointment of having her honor questioned. It was then that Joaquin Alberto surprised everyone. "There was no theft," he declared with a firm voice, approaching Maria de los Dolores and gently taking her hand. "This brooch was offered by me as an advance dowry. Maria de los Dolores and I are engaged to be married." The silence that followed was deep as a well. Doña Perpetua paled, understanding that her plot had turned against her. Joaquin Alberto continued, his eyes fixed on his beloved's face. "The ceremony will be celebrated next month with God's blessing and before whoever wishes to witness." How would this unexpected declaration change everything forever? On the night that followed Doña Perpetua's expulsion, the plantation's library filled with a new intimacy. The fireplace flames danced on the book-lined walls, creating shadows that seemed to guard ancestral secrets. Maria de los Dolores and Joaquin Alberto found themselves there, she embroidering in silence, he pretending to read, but actually observing her every graceful movement. "Why did you do that?" she finally asked, without lifting her eyes from the embroidery. "Why did you lie to protect me?" Joaquin Alberto closed the book and walked to the window, contemplating the darkness that stretched beyond the coffee plantations. The full moon bathed the landscape with its silver light, transforming the valley into an ethereal vision. "It wasn't a lie," he said quietly. It was revelation. He turned toward her, and Maria de los Dolores could see in his eyes an ocean of contained pain. Mariana Candida died 3 years ago, he began, his voice choked with emotion. But it wasn't yellow fever that took her. It was heartbreak. The words that followed painted the tragedy of a young woman who dared to love beyond social barriers. Mariana Candida had fallen in love with Juan Benedicto, a free mulatto, teacher, and man of fine character. The love was reciprocated and genuine, but the Vasconcelos family could not bear the dishonor. I pressured her to break the engagement, confessed Joaquin Alberto, tears flowing freely down his face. I told her to think of the family name, the reputation, everything except her heart. She obeyed but never forgave me, nor did I forgive myself. Maria de los Dolores left the embroidery and approached him, gently touching his face. The guilt wasn't yours, she murmured. It belonged to the times. I swore on her grave, he continued, covering her hand with his, that I would never again let prejudice destroy love. That's why when I looked at you in that warehouse, I knew God was giving me a second chance. He knelt before her, taking both her hands. Marry me, Maria de los Dolores, not out of obligation or gratitude, but because my heart doesn't beat right away from yours. What response would she give to such a sincere proposal? September brought not only the first flowers of spring, but also an unexpected visit that would make Francisco's heart tighten with fear. Benedicta arrived in a dusty cart, accompanied by a man who introduced himself as Dr. Mendonça, a lawyer from Taubaté. The 40-something woman had in her eyes the hardness of one who had faced life without mercy. She dressed in black, like a perpetual widow, and carried in her calloused hands the roughness of those who worked without rest. I came to get my nephew, she announced, looking at Chiquito, who had hidden behind Maria de los Dolores. Francisco is my brother's son, and by right belongs to me. Joaquin Alberto studied the woman with a penetrating gaze. There was something in her posture, in the way she avoided looking directly at the child, that aroused his suspicion. And where were you when Francisco lived as an orphan in the abandoned shack? He inquired, his voice controlled but firm. Working to support my own children, she replied. But now I can raise him. Doctor, Mendonça here present will confirm my rights. The lawyer, a thin man with fogged glasses, confirmed with nervous gestures, but it was Maria de los Dolores who, with her feminine sensitivity, perceived the truth behind the farce. What work do you intend to give the child? She asked, her voice sweet but determined. Benedicta's evasive look betrayed her. Well, honest work. In a textile factory in São Paulo, a child who doesn't work becomes a vagrant. Francisco began to cry silently, and at that moment Joaquin Alberto understood the entire situation. The woman intended to sell the child's labor, exploit his innocence, in the name of questionable legal guardianship. Francisco, he said, kneeling before the child, do you want to go with your aunt or stay here with us? The answer came between sobs. I want to stay. Here I have a real family. Joaquin Alberto stood up, his eyes blazing with determination. Dr. Mendonça, what documents would be necessary for the legal adoption of this child? How would this battle for little Francisco's future be resolved? The negotiation extended throughout the afternoon in the plantation's main hall, while outside the cicadas sang the arrival of summer. Joaquin Alberto, a man accustomed to coffee business, demonstrated the same skill in legal matters involving Francisco's future. 500,000 reis, he offered Benedicta, as compensation for the expenses you had with the child until now. The woman's eyes gleamed with greed. It was a considerable amount, much more than she would earn selling the boy's services to the factory. And 100,000 reis more for Dr. Mendonça's fees, continued Joaquin Alberto, for the preparation of guardianship transfer documents. The lawyer, who until then had remained in calculating silence, became animated with the prospect of such generous fees. Certainly we can reach an agreement beneficial to all parties, he murmured, nervously cleaning his glasses. Maria de los Dolores observed Francisco throughout the negotiation. The child remained by her side, firmly holding her hand, as if he feared that at any moment he could be dragged away from the security he had finally found. There is one more condition, added Joaquin Alberto, fixing his gaze on Benedicta. You will sign a document renouncing any future rights over Francisco. This agreement is definitive and irrevocable. When the papers were signed and Benedicta departed with her 1,000 reis, leaving behind only the smell of satisfied greed, Francisco ran into Joaquin Alberto's arms. Am I really your son now? He asked, his voice choked with emotion. "My son and Maria de los Dolores," he confirmed, embracing the child tenderly. "Forever." That night, in the violet room, Maria de los Dolores contemplated through the window the stars that shone over the coffee plantations. Joaquin Alberto approached from behind, enveloping her in his arms. "Our marriage will be blessed by God from the first day," he murmured in her ear. "We already have a son to love." What would the ceremony be like that would seal this unlikely union? October 15, 1884, dawned radiant at the Santa Helena plantation. The first rains of the season had washed the air, and the perfume of the first coffee flowers floated gently over the valley. The plantation's small chapel, built by Joaquin Alberto's grandparents, was adorned with arrangements of white roses and violets as a silent homage to Mariana Candida's memory. Maria de los Dolores wore her late sister-in-law's wedding dress, lovingly adjusted by the skilled hands of Seña Rosa, the plantation's seamstress. The ivory silk dress with Bruges lace and delicate embroidery transformed her into a vision of grace and elegance that cut the heart of anyone who contemplated her. Francisco, dressed in his first suit, a gift from Joaquin Alberto, carried the rings on a small velvet cushion. His eyes shone with pride at participating in such a solemn moment in his adoptive parents' lives. Father Antonio, a progressive man who came especially from São Paulo, conducted the ceremony with words that resonated through the chapel like celestial music. May this marriage be an example of how true love transcends the barriers that men erect, and how God's goodness manifests through those who have the courage to love beyond prejudices. Among those present were abolitionists from the region, progressive landowners, and plantation workers. Half of the local Good Society had boycotted the ceremony, but those who attended witnessed something they would never forget: the union of two souls who defied their time to find happiness. When Joaquin Alberto kissed his wife, sealing their vows before the altar, Francisco applauded with childish enthusiasm, drawing emotional smiles from those present. The celebration that followed was simple but warm. Under the stars that began to dot the darkening sky, the guests danced to the sound of a small orchestra of local musicians. Maria de los Dolores, now Doña Maria de los Dolores de Vasconcelos, waltzed in her husband's arms, as if floating on a cloud of happiness. What challenges awaited the new family in the times to come? The first months of marriage brought profound changes to the Santa Helena plantation. Joaquin Alberto, inspired by Maria de los Dolores' love and Francisco's presence, began implementing reforms that caused amazement and admiration among the workers. The old slave quarters were transformed into dignified houses for free workers. A school was opened for all children on the property, without distinction of color or origin. Francisco became the first student, but was soon joined by a dozen little ones, eager to learn their first letters. Maria de los Dolores assumed direction of the big house with a firm hand, but tender heart. She organized a medicinal garden, taught the plantation women to sew and embroider, created an assistance system for needy families. Her presence brought peace and prosperity to every corner of the property. It was in December, when the heat began to intensify and the coffee plantations filled with the intense green of vigorous plants, that the first worrying news of changes in the empire's capital arrived. Major Venancio visited the plantation on a stifling afternoon, his face heavy with concern. "Joaquin Alberto," he said, wiping sweat with an embroidered handkerchief, "the winds blowing from Rio de Janeiro are not favorable to us landowners. There's increasingly talk of total abolition of slavery." Joaquin Alberto smiled, putting his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Let those winds come, Major. This plantation has been preparing for months for the future." The neighbor's disapproving look swept over Maria de los Dolores, who remained serene, embroidering an altar cloth for the chapel. "Your reforms are admirable," continued Venancio, "but I fear you're anticipating the times too much. Society isn't prepared for so many changes." It was Francisco who, running through the hall with his school books, involuntarily interrupted the adults' serious conversation. "Papa!" he shouted, hugging Joaquin Alberto's legs. "I learned to write my full name today, Francisco de Vasconcelos." How would these transformations affect the destiny of the entire region? The spring of 1885 brought to the Santa Helena plantation a joy that spread like flower perfume through the big house corridors. Maria de los Dolores carried in her womb the first fruit of her love with Joaquin Alberto, and the pregnancy illuminated her face with a special brightness that enchanted everyone. Francisco, now 9 years old and already able to read and write skillfully, anxiously prepared to be a big brother. He spent hours talking to the baby who had not yet been born, telling stories and promising to teach everything he had learned in school. "My little brother is going to be very intelligent," he would say, delicately caressing the adoptive mother's belly. "I'm going to teach him to read, to write, and to ride a horse." Joaquin Alberto observed these scenes with his heart overflowing with gratitude. His family grew in love and harmony at a time when so many other families were falling apart because of growing social tensions. The plantation prospered like never before. The free workers, motivated by the dignity of their labor and the fair wages they received, produced superior quality coffee. The innovations implemented by Joaquin Alberto began to attract the attention of other progressive landowners in the region. In May, when morning still brought the freshness of autumn, Juan Alberto was born, a boy with skin golden as honey and green eyes like his father's. Francisco held his little brother with infinite care, tears of joy streaming down his face. "Now we are a complete family," murmured Joaquin Alberto, kissing Maria de los Dolores' sweaty forehead. But family joy contrasted with increasingly alarming news arriving from the capital. Abolitionist movements were gaining strength, and there were rumors that a definitive law would soon be voted on. On a June afternoon, while Maria de los Dolores nursed Juan Alberto in the Violet Room, a messenger arrived with a letter that would change everything. What news would bring such definitive consequences? The letter came from Rio de Janeiro, signed by Councillor Antonio Prado, an influential man in the court's abolitionist circles. The invitation was bold and dangerous. Joaquin Alberto was invited to testify in the empire's capital about the successful experiences with free labor on his plantation. "Your Excellence has become an example of what Brazil's future can be," the letter said. "Your testimony can help convince the last resistors that abolition will not mean economic ruin." Joaquin Alberto read the letter several times, feeling the weight of the responsibility being offered to him. Maria de los Dolores, still recovering from childbirth, observed him with a worried look. "It's dangerous," she murmured, adjusting Juan Alberto in her lap. "Slave-holding landowners will not forgive whoever testifies in favor of abolition, but it's the right thing to do," he replied, kneeling beside the armchair where she rested. "How can I enjoy the happiness we found and not fight for others to have the same opportunity?" Francisco, who had heard the conversation, approached with his 9 years of precocious wisdom. "Papa," he said, his voice serious beyond his age, "you taught me that good people must have courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult." The look that Joaquin Alberto and Maria de los Dolores exchanged was charged with pride and emotion. Their adoptive son perfectly understood the moral lesson they had transmitted to him. The decision was made on a golden August morning. Joaquin Alberto would depart for Rio de Janeiro, leaving the plantation in the care of Maria de los Dolores and a trusted administrator. The farewell was touching. Francisco embraced his adoptive father forcefully, promising to take care of his mother and little brother. "Come back soon, Papa," he whispered. "The family isn't complete without you." While the carriage moved away down the dusty road, Maria de los Dolores held Juan Alberto against her chest and silently prayed for divine protection. What consequences would this brave journey to the empire's capital bring? In the great hall of the imperial palace, Joaquin Alberto found himself before Brazil's most powerful men. Senators, ministers, councillors, and Emperor Dom Pedro II himself were present to hear testimonies about the abolitionist question that divided the nation. Dressed in his finest suit, but without losing the simplicity that characterized him, Joaquin Alberto recounted his experience at the Santa Helena plantation. He spoke of the prosperity that came with free labor, of the dignity that transformed workers into partners, of the school that illuminated young minds with knowledge. "To Your Majesty," he said, addressing the emperor, "abolition is not just a question of moral justice, it is a question of national progress. A nation built on free labor will always be more prosperous than one erected on chains." His words resonated through the hall with the force of lived truth. He told about Francisco, the orphan boy who now read Camões and dreamed of being a lawyer. He spoke of Maria de los Dolores, whose intelligence and kindness had transformed not only his life, but the entire plantation. The Baron of Cotegipe, a fierce defender of slavery, tried to question the economic viability of the proposed model, but Joaquin Alberto responded with numbers and facts that silenced objections. "My plantation's productivity increased by 40% since we abolished slave labor," he declared. "Free men work with their hearts, and this is reflected in the product's quality." After 3 days of intense debates, Joaquin Alberto was received in private audience by the emperor. Dom Pedro II, a man with a white beard and eyes tired by the crown's weight, listened attentively to the detailed account of transformations at the Santa Helena plantation. "Colonel Vasconcelos," said the emperor at the end, "your courage in defying the prejudices of your time honors the best of the Brazilian soul. Men like you give us hope that we can build a truly free and prosperous nation." The return journey to São Paulo was made with a light heart, but also with awareness of the role he would be called to play in times to come. How would the plantation have transformed during his absence? Joaquin Alberto returned to the Santa Helena plantation on a golden September afternoon, when spring rains began to awaken new life in the coffee plantations. What he found exceeded all his expectations. The property was more prosperous and organized than he had ever seen. Maria de los Dolores had implemented a cooperative system among the workers, where each family participated in profits proportionally to their effort. The school had grown, and now also served children from neighboring plantations. Francisco stood out as the best student and already helped teach the younger ones. "My love," he said, embracing his wife and small son, "you transformed this place into a piece of paradise." It was on that same afternoon that news arrived that would forever change Brazil's destiny. A panting horseman brought the capital's newspaper with the headline in enormous letters, "Golden Law Approved, Total Abolition of Slavery in Brazil." The silence that followed was deep as prayer. Then, gradually, a murmur of joy spread among the workers gathering in the big house courtyard. Tears of happiness ran down the faces of those who finally saw their full humanity recognized. Francisco was the first to break the solemn silence. "Now all children like me will be able to study," he exclaimed, jumping with joy. Joaquin Alberto gathered all the plantation workers on the ground where the pillory once functioned, now transformed into a flowering garden. With a voice choked with emotion, he read aloud the decree that definitively abolished slavery in Brazil. "My friends," he said at the end, "this plantation was a laboratory of freedom even before the law made it mandatory. You proved that free men build a better Brazil." Maria de los Dolores, holding Juan Alberto in her lap, observed the workers' radiant faces and understood they had participated in something much greater than their own lives. They were part of a historical transformation that would be remembered for generations. "May God bless this day," she murmured, "and may our children grow up in a truly free country." How would this historic victory forever seal the family's destiny? 4 years later, May 1888, the garden of the Santa Helena plantation was in its fullest glory. Climbing roses covered the big house veranda, their red petals contrasting with the immaculate white of the walls. In the gazebo built where the abandoned shack once stood, Francisco, now 12 years old, read aloud to his 3 younger siblings, 4-year-old Juan Alberto, little 2-year-old Mariana Candida, and baby Antonio, born the previous year. Maria de los Dolores, at 28 years old, radiated the serenity of a fulfilled woman. She embroidered on the terrace while watching the children, her heart peaceful with the harmony that reigned in her home. Beside her, Joaquin Alberto reviewed the plantation books, which showed prosperity never before achieved. The Santa Helena plantation had become a model for the entire Paraíba Valley. Landowners from various regions came to know the miracle of Santa Helena, as the press had baptized the successful experience of transition to free labor. "Papa," said Francisco, closing the poetry book he was reading to his siblings, "when I become a lawyer, I want to defend people like we were before." Joaquin Alberto smiled, remembering the frightened boy he had found hidden in the abandoned mill. "And you will be a great lawyer," he confirmed, "perhaps the first in our region." Maria de los Dolores raised her eyes from the embroidery and contemplated the family they had built together. 4 children educated without distinction, free and prosperous workers, a community where respect and dignity were the supreme values. "Do you know what I think?" she said, her voice sweet as always. "I think Mariana Candida would be proud to see what was born from her pain." The afternoon fell softly over the coffee plantations when the last gift destiny reserved for them arrived. An elegant carriage stopped in the courtyard, from which descended a middle-aged man, a mulatto with fine features and distinguished bearing. "Colonel Vasconcelos?" he said, removing his hat. "I am Juan Benedicto, a retired professor. I was Mariana Candida's fiancé." The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Joaquin Alberto approached slowly, his eyes moist. "Juan Benedicto," he murmured, "for years I searched for you to ask forgiveness." "There is nothing to forgive," replied the man, his voice choked. I learned of your courage, how you honored her memory. I came to thank you for making possible the love that was denied to us." The two men embraced in the plantation's flowering courtyard, sealing a reconciliation that transcended time and pain. That night, while stars shone over the blessed valley, Francisco asked his adoptive father, "Papa, will our story have a happy ending?" Joaquin Alberto embraced the boy who had become a man, contemplated the wife who had transformed his life, and the children who were the promise of a better Brazil. "Our story, my son, has no end. It will continue in every child who studies, in every free worker, in every heart that chooses love instead of hatred." And so, in the perfumed silence of the tropical night, the family contemplated the future with the certainty that true love builds eternal legacies.